My company today is Mr. Ralph Ellison, a man who some years ago referred to himself, if I'm not mistaken, as an invisible man.
Harrison and Company. Brought to you by the many fine products of General Foods. Now here's Channel 5's Director of Public Affairs, John D. Harrison.
I'm going to read to you from the book Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. And Ralph, you wrote this book how many years ago now? 25, 30 years ago?
About 25 years ago. It's getting
So I don't know how often you've looked at this or whether you still agree with what you wrote then, but here's what you wrote then. I am an invisible man. No, I'm not a spook like those who haunted Edgar Allan Poe, nor am I one of your Hollywood movie ectoplasms. I'm a man of substance, of flesh and bone, fiber and liquids, and I might even be said to possess a mind. I'm invisible, understand, simply because people refuse to see me. When they approach me, they see only my surroundings, themselves, or figments of their imagination. Indeed, everything and anything except me. Well, that's 25 years ago. Is it still true?
Well, I think a certain distinction should be made. This is a fictional character.
I wondered how fictional it was.
Mostly.
Is it really?
Yes. It's this is my novel, but actually it's his memoir. And I don't think I was ever quite as, shall we say, dumb as he confesses himself to be.
Oh, I don't think that's dumb. There again, I suppose you run into this all the time, that people are telling you what your book is about, and I suppose I'm no better or no worse than the rest of your readers, but I have, of course, automatically presumed that this was at least semi-autobiographical.
No.
Is it not?
No, it isn't. If you ask around, you'll find that none of these things happened to me. Perhaps you might find people who say, oh, yes, I was there when it happened, but that only means that I succeeded in making the fiction.
And there was never the smoker that you write about, and the boy who wrote the theme on humility, and
oh, no.
And that was never you, and that was never actual.
There were battle royals fought before certain men smokers in Oklahoma City at the time, but none such as that.
Well, you know, one of the reasons that I felt that it was an actual event was that you used the name Concord in there, which is a fine old Oklahoma name.
Yes, well, you see, my father was a construction foreman of the crew that built the Concord building.
Is that right?
And I have the photograph of the topping off ceremony. My father, indeed, came to Oklahoma with the crew, and they built the first steel and concrete buildings in Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Texas. And he joined that group, I think, in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And he worked with them until I was born. My mother got tired of his being on the road. So he gave up construction work and opened an ice and cold business here in the city.
Well, I don't know whether you have been informed of this or not, but the Concord building is one of the few original buildings that have been built in Oklahoma City's history that will remain after urban renewal is finished with its work.
Yes. Well, it pleases me no end because it leaves some connection with my father's past.
Does it tear your heart out to come back home and see what's happened?
It does. A few years ago, when I brought my wife out for the first time, I was able to walk around and said I was born in this house. I lived in this house. My father died when we were living at this place. Even the old University Hospital where he died and where my mother washed test tubes for 7 years in the biological lab there, all that has gone, really. So I feel that I've been shorn of some of my past, and thank God I'm the kind of person who dreams a lot, because I dream about Oklahoma City, and that world comes alive again.
Have you been a dreamer always, Ralph? This is not a late occurrence, is it?
No. Oklahoma City was a kind of place which inspired dreaming. The mixture of people who had come from other places, the closeness of the reality upon which the mythological, legendary Oklahoma was based, was always intermixed. Some of the people who came back from our high school reunion used to spend part of their time on Indian reservations down in Anadarko. They were Oklahoma natives, that is, they had head rights in one of the tribes, and were culturally American Indian as well as culturally Afro-American Oklahoman. And that,
you have very much a historical perspective, don't you? You're kind of a historian, and you're certainly a scholar. I noticed in your remarks at the library on Saturday that you referred to the fact that you were born just 7 years after Oklahoma had been made a state. And do you feel that this is one of the reasons why, I don't know, I feel that Oklahoma is less entrenched in its prejudices than other parts of the country? Am I correct, or am I living a fool's?
No, I think you're quite right, and I've often said this, much to the irritation of some of my friends in New York. And I base it upon the historical reality that there was never a real history of slavery here, that Oklahoma never became structured along racial lines in the way that would have been true had it been an older state.
Everybody, in a sense, brought a certain amount of that heritage with them, of course. But at least they didn't have 200 years or 100 years of plantation heritage behind them to rely on.
Of course. It hadn't gotten built in, and there was always an uneasiness about it. And the other thing about Oklahoma, you see, there was never a time when I didn't know white people and when they weren't coming into the house. My father was a veteran of the Spanish-American War, and he and some of the white veterans were always getting together, talking. They were friends. Mr. Lilly, who was the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company representative here, was a good friend of my father's. And he would come not only to do business, but to break bread. And
well, now that didn't happen often, and we'll get back and talk to Ralph, but right now let's take a break. We're speaking with Mr. Ralph Ellison, author of Invisible Man, who has been in Oklahoma City here these last few days, dedicating the new Ralph Ellison branch of the Oklahoma City Library. And a beautiful building it is, and a beautiful series of meetings and reunions it must have been for you, Ralph, although I suppose it's a little uncomfortable being the subject of so much adulation, isn't it?
Well, someone had to be the focal point of it, and it turned out that fell to me. A very heady, emotional experience with all the people coming that you hadn't seen for 40 years, and people responding to that, what lay underneath the building, what lay underneath the ceremony.
You know, as a matter of fact, I should dig something up for you. It just popped into my mind that you would probably love to see, and the news department will hate me, but I think we may have some film of Jimmy Stewart's appearance before the city council.
Oh, yes.
When he pleaded for the recognition of Ralph Ellison in this library. And if you know Jimmy, his heart is way out here, you know. And it was certainly in evidence that day, and he gave an eloquent reasoning for this. And of course, I think Jimmy Stewart really takes the lion's share of the credit for doing that. He's an old friend, isn't he?
Yes, he's an old schoolmate, classmate at one period. I lived for a year with my aunt out on what was then Peach Street, then Bower.
Where?
Peach Street. That was a street...
in Oklahoma City?
In Oklahoma City. They changed the name to Bower.
Oh.
But Archett Park School was on that street, and I think I began to know Jimmy when I was attending the 3rd grade out there.
Yeah. You were, your parents, were they a little bit more literate than most, Jimmy? They must have been they fostered such a son. They must have been a little bit more intellectually curious than most, or had some qualities that reached out and grabbed the world or wanted to introduce you to the world.
Oh, I think that they were like many parents who had come here, before statehood or around the time of statehood. My father, as a young man, had joined the Army. He fought in the Spanish-American War and the Boxer Rebellion. He was in the Philippines. But somewhere along the way, he had become a passionate reader. He died when I was 3, but I associated him with books, newspapers. We had a trick dog, a dog that did tricks.
Really?
And we used to, I can remember as a little child being driven up Broadway there near the old Kincaid Hotel.
Yeah.
There was a famous newsstand on the corner. And this dog had been trained to jump off the wagon, pick up a newspaper, and jump back on. Magazines and things were always around.
Was it he or your mother that named you Ralph Waldo?
He named me Ralph Waldo.
Well, now, obviously, having been an Emerson
That's right.
aficionado, huh?
The other thing about it is that there was this appreciation for literature, and better still, I had friends whose parents owned libraries. The first set of the Harvard classics that I encountered was in the home of Dr. and Mrs. Whitby. These people had the works of Maupassant and George Bernard Shaw and such people.
You probably read de Maupassant before you knew how to pronounce de Maupassant.
This is quite true. I read, what's his name, Schopenhauer, and the little Julius Haldeman blue books and gray books. You remember those?
No, I don't at all.
Yes, well, these were published in Girard, Kansas by the Appeal to Reason Press. And they were all over the East Side for kids who were interested. I think they cost a nickel, and you'd get a little excerpt
I'll be darned.
somebody's name you couldn't pronounce.
I've never heard of this.
Yes.
Well, I guess really music was
Yes.
where your heart was. Now,
Exactly.
your mind was with books, but your heart was with music, and it was really music that propelled you for a period of time, wasn't it?
Yes.
An interest in music?
An interest in music. I was taught to play an old E-flat horn. We used to call them peck horns in the bands. This was an upright. Mr. Meade.
It ends up going up like that?
That's
does it?
right. Later they were designed to look like the French horn. They
I
were the
see.
same pitch.
I see.
But Mr. Joseph Meade, who owned a barbershop on Walnut near First Street, his son was about my age. One day he called the two of us out into his backyard. He presented the son with his own trumpet and gave me the peck horn, wrote out the scale of C, lettered the fingering, and gave us our first instruction in music.
boy.
But what was so important in the lives of Frank Meade and myself, and of course so many, many people, some of whom became famous musicians, was the school music program, which was directed by Mrs. Elian Brough. And I must say that Oklahoma City, the school board provided a lot of our instruments, and we got good support. And that created an atmosphere wherein you were able to get a discipline in art. It was a musical discipline, but later on, when I found I was going to be a writer, the transference was not that strange.
I want to talk about the early day Oklahoma City musicians in just a moment. Let's take a break right now for this word. Ralph, it's, I suppose, somewhat of a tragedy for you to see Deep Second today as compared with your youth. And I understand that Deep Second and music, fine jazz, well, the two were almost synonymous at one time.
I think so. We hear a lot about Kansas City jazz, and it's overlooked that it was as much Oklahoma City jazz, that any number of the musicians played in Oklahoma City. Sometimes they stayed here for a month on end. I remember Lester Young, when he was not the famous musician that he was to become, being right there on Deep Second, hanging around Hallie Richardson's pool hall, where most of the musicians hung.
Well, Hallie Richardson's pool hall was really the center, wasn't it?
Not pool hall, it's worse than that. It was a shoe shine parlor. Very tiny place with a room in the back where sometimes they would rehearse, or sometimes they would. I've seen Lester Young's sitting with his feet on the shoe rest.
Oh, really?
Playing his big tenor saxophone. And across the street at the Aldrich, which was owned by Mrs. Brough and Mr. Whitlow, she brought in the acts that traveled around the country for the Theater Owners Booking Association. This was a group that supplied talent for Negro theaters. And this was, again, rather unique, because you would hear King Oliver sometimes once a month. Ida Cox was there frequently. Ma Rainey was there frequently. You had that rich jazz and blues tradition. You had very fine jazz musicians who were also conservatory trained, playing in the pit of the Aldrich. And then for our school operettas, and Douglas put on an operetta, Mrs. Brough did, every year, and the theater was used for the operettas. So you got the coming together of two streams of musical tradition, and you learned to appreciate what was valuable in each of them.
It's not there now. It doesn't seem to be anywhere now, is it?
Well, it's beginning to be revived. There's jazz.
I mean, this richness, the richness and the pervasiveness and the presence of what you speak about. It just seemed like it was so obvious that it was impossible to avoid.
Yes.
You know, and rather than that, there seems to be a void.
Well,
of this
in this country, we are very wasteful of our artistic heritage, especially when it's a vernacular heritage.
We seem to think if it's cheap, it's not valuable.
That's right. Or if we do see it as valuable, too often commercial interests exploit the newness of it. And then, since they sell mainly novelty, they discard something which it took the 200 years that we've been a nation to develop, was something which they present as better.
And they take text out of context, too.
Of course.
And, and it leaves the context without
leaves a void.
With anything.
And it leaves us ignorant of where things came. I can remember the sense of irony with which I began to hear about swing and its discovery, our invention in New York or somewhere, or Chicago. I said, well, the guys who were playing it were right here. Some of them were going to school over at Old Douglas. Charlie Christian, for instance,
Right.
who lived over there in what was certainly a slum, but went to school with me, was in my brother's class, absorbing that mixture of musical traditions which was to be found, and in fact you couldn't escape it here. And then suddenly it surfaces under the auspices of those people who make a business of entertainment, and it's given a slightly different name, and a new past was manufactured for it.
It makes you wish, maybe, I don't know whether that would be, whether it's like a snowflake, once you touch it, it dissolves, but it makes you almost wish that we had had a promoter at that time that could have said, hey, this is Oklahoma City jazz, this is Oklahoma City music.
I think so. I think there was a Mr. Buttrick who had a ballroom here. I forgot the name of it. He understood what was valuable, and by providing jobs for many of the musicians, he made possible a further development of their styles. So it had a real anchoring, and it had a real sponsorship among local people. Slaughter's Hall, which was not a very large ballroom, but it provided space for everybody from local small bands in which I played to Duke Ellington. In 1930 or 31, Duke Ellington was out here with us.
You know, I wish there was some way to bring that aliveness and that history back to life. Maybe we're doing a little of that today. We'll be back in just a moment. I've just been handed the news that our time is pretty well up. We've been visiting with Ralph Ellison. Ralph, it's been a great pleasure talking to you, and I hope, how often do you get back into Oklahoma City?
As often as I can.
About once every 10 years?
No, I've done a little better than that. I've tried to arrange my life so I could get back every year, but it's very difficult.
Well, I hope very much that the next time you come back, we might have an opportunity to dig into this again and talk about Oklahoma City in the past from your viewpoint, which is a valuable viewpoint and one that we cherish very much and would like to keep alive.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to talk with someone about that part. I'm old enough now to find it of interest.
They must have been rich days. Ralph Ellison, thanks very much for being with me.
My pleasure.
Thank you for joining us.
Harrison and Company is a public affairs presentation of KOCO-TV, brought to you by the many fine products of General Foods.
This has been a public affairs presentation of KOCO-TV, a station of Combined Communications Corporation.
And thank you for being with us.
Harrison and Company is a public affairs presentation of KOCO-TV, brought to you by the many fine products of General Foods.
This has been a public affairs presentation of KOCO-TV, a station of Combined Communications Corporation.
There's a program that's appealed to me for some time, and our program on Harrison and Company next week